Spread your legs, and let me see." Young widow obeyed Mafia boss alone. On Christmas Eve night, the snow had been falling since early morning, a relentless curtain of white that erased the world outside the cottage windows. Inside, the silence was absolute, save for the crackle of the dry logs settling in the hearth and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Grace sat curled in the corner of her oversized beige sofa, a glass of deep red wine resting loosely in her fingers. She stared at the dark liquid, watching the firelight dance across the surface, refusing to look at the phone buzzing on the coffee table. It was her mother again, or perhaps her sister. It did not matter. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted her to come to dinner. They wanted to see her smile. They wanted to pretend that the empty chair at the table did not exist, or worse. They wanted to fill the silence with pitying glances and soft voices, treating her like a piece of porcelain that had already shattered and been poorly glued back together. Grace took a long sip of the wine. It was bitter, heavy on her tongue, but it warmed the hollow ache in her chest. She was 32 years old, and this was her first Christmas Eve alone. 6 months. That was how long it had been since the police had knocked on her door at 3 a.m. The memory hit her like a physical blow, as it often did when the house was this quiet. She closed her eyes and saw the flashing red and blue lights painting the front lawn. She could still smell the acrid smoke that had clung to the officer's uniform. "Your husband was involved in an accident, Mrs. Miller." It had not been an accident. Cars did not simply explode on empty stretches of highway unless someone wanted them to. The investigation had been a whirlwind of confusion, whispers of foul play, shadowy implications of debts she knew nothing about, and questions she could not answer. But in the end, the case had gone cold. No suspects, no arrests, just a closed casket and a life insurance policy that felt like blood money. The phone buzzed again, dancing across the wood of the table. Grace reached out and flipped it face down. She was not going to answer. She was going to drink this bottle of wine, stare at the snow, and wait for the sun to rise so she could say she had survived another holiday. A sudden, tearing screech from outside shattered her solitude. It was the sound of rubber shredding against asphalt, followed by the sickening crunch of metal impacting solid ice. The house shuddered. Grace bolted upright, her wine splashing onto her hand. For a heartbeat, she froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that followed was heavier than before. She set the glass down and grabbed the heavy flashlight she kept by the door. Slipping her feet into her boots, she threw her woolen coat over her silk blouse, buttoning it with trembling fingers. She lived on the outskirts of the city, down a winding road that the plows often ignored. If someone had crashed, they were miles from help. Grace pushed open the front door. The wind howled, biting at her exposed cheeks. She shielded her eyes against the driving snow, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the white chaos. 50 yards away, a black SUV had careened off the road. It was nose-deep in a snowbank. Steam hissing from the crumpled hood. The vehicle looked like a beast that had been slain mid-charge. "Hello?" Grace called out, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Is anyone there?" No answer. She trudged through the knee-deep drifts, the cold seeping through her jeans. As she neared the car, she saw the driver's side door hanging open. The interior light was flickering. A man was slumped in the driver's seat. He was large, his shoulders filling the width of the bucket seat. He wore a black suit that looked expensive, though it was now ruined by the deployment of the airbag and the dark stain spreading across his white dress shirt. Grace reached the door, aiming the light at his face. He was conscious. That was the first thing she noticed. His eyes were open, dark and alert, showing none of the dazed confusion of a crash victim. He was looking at her with a sharp, assessing gaze that made her step back. "Are you hurt?" Grace asked, her breath pluming in the air. "I can call an ambulance." The man groaned low in his throat as he shifted. A hand, large and scarred across the knuckles, went to his side. "No ambulance," he gritted out. His voice was deep, rough like gravel churning in a mixer. "You're bleeding," Grace argued, pointing the light at his midsection. The crimson stain was expanding. "You need a hospital." I said no, he snapped, the command in his voice unmistakable. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the flashlight. I just need to get off this road. Help me out. Grace hesitated. Every instinct she had screamed that this was dangerous. Normal people did not refuse ambulances after crashing their cars into snowbanks. Normal people did not look at their rescuers with that kind of cold calculation. But looking at the blood seeping between his fingers, she knew she could not leave him here to freeze. My house is just there, she said, pointing behind her. Can you walk? He didn't answer. He simply gritted his teeth and hauled himself out of the car. He stumbled as his feet hit the ice, and Grace surged forward, catching his arm. He was heavy, a wall of solid muscle and heat. He leaned into her, his scent overwhelming the crisp smell of snow, leather, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of copper. Easy, she murmured, wrapping an arm around his waist to steady him. They made the slow, agonizing trek back to the cottage. By the time they reached the porch, Grace was breathless, her muscles burning from the effort of supporting his weight. She kicked the door open and guided him inside, the warmth of the living room wrapping around them. She helped him to the sofa, where he sank down with a heavy exhale. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a moment. In the better light, Grace saw that he was devastatingly handsome in a severe, brutal way. He had a strong jaw shadowed by stubble, a nose that looked like it had been broken once and healed straight, and jet-black hair that fell over his forehead. I need a first aid kit, he said, opening his eyes. He watched her lock the front door. And whiskey. If you have it. I have wine, Grace said, shedding her coat. Whiskey, he corrected, his tone leaving no room for debate. Grace felt a spark of irritation flare in her chest. He was bleeding on her beige upholstery and barking orders like he owned the place. I have a bottle in the cabinet. I will get the kit. She moved to the bathroom, her hands shaking as she gathered the supplies. Gauze, antiseptic, tape, scissors. When she returned to the living room, he had already removed his jacket and unbuttoned his shirt. Grace paused. His torso was a landscape of hard muscle and old scars, etched onto him like a map of violence. The fresh wound was a gash along his ribs. It looked deep, but the bleeding had slowed. She set the supplies on the coffee table and handed him a glass of amber liquid. He downed it in one swallow, not even wincing at the burn. Sit back, she instructed, kneeling beside him. He watched her as she worked. His gaze was heavy, a physical weight on her skin. As she dabbed the antiseptic onto the wound, his stomach muscles clenched, but he made no sound. You have done this before, he observed. It was not a question. My husband was clumsy. Grace lied. Her husband had been an accountant who fainted at the sight of a paper cut. She had learned to dress wounds volunteering at a shelter years ago, but she did not feel like sharing her biography with this stranger. You're lucky. It needs stitches. But if you keep it bound tight, it will close. Luck has nothing to do with it, he murmured. Grace finished taping the gauze in place. She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a towel. I am Grace. He looked at her, his dark eyes traveling from her face down to her throat and lower, taking in the silk blouse she wore. Luca? Just Luca? For tonight, yes. He sat up, testing the bandage. He seemed to recover with alarming speed, his movements regaining that fluid, predatory confidence she had noticed outside. You live here alone? Grace? The question was casual, but the intent was sharp. Grace stiffened. My husband is away on business, she said, the lie slipping out automatically. Luca smirked, a dry, humorless expression. No, he is not. There is no ring on your finger, but there is a shadow in your eyes. And a woman waiting for her husband on Christmas Eve does not ignore the phone 3 times in 10 minutes. He nodded toward her cell phone, which had lit up silently again. Grace felt exposed, her cheeks flushing. You are very observant of a man who just crashed a car. It keeps me alive, Luca said. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The proximity was suffocating. Thank you. For help. Most people would have left me there. I considered it, she admitted. He laughed, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate on the floorboards. I bet you did. You have a cautious look about you. Angel. Like a deer that smells the wolf but doesn't know which way to run. I am not a deer, Grace said, standing up. She needed distance. And do not call me Angel. Whatever you say. I need to change, she announced abruptly. Her jeans were soaked from the snow and her blouse felt damp against her skin. Stay here. Do not touch anything. Luca raised his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes glittered with amusement. I am at your mercy. Grace walked down the short hallway to her bedroom. She left the door slightly ajar, a habit formed in the months of living alone, a need to hear the house. She moved to her dresser, pulling out a dry pair of leggings and a thick, oversized sweater. As she began to unbutton her blouse, a prickle of awareness ran down her spine. She froze. Across the hall, in the living room, hung an ornate decorative mirror through the crack in her door. She could see the reflection of the sofa. Luca had not moved. He was still sitting there, glass in hand, but he was not looking at the fire. He was looking at the mirror. The angle was perfect. He could see straight into her room. He was watching her, his gaze unblinking, dark and intense. He made no effort to hide it. He did not look away when she paused. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, drinking in the sight of her pale skin as the silk slid off her shoulders. Grace's breath hitched. She should have slammed the door. She should have marched out there and demanded he leave, but she did not. A strange, paralyzed heat bloomed in her stomach. She turned her back to the door, her fingers fumbling as she pulled the sweater over her head, hiding herself. When she returned to the living room 5 minutes later, Luca was staring into the fire. He did not apologize. He did not look guilty. He looked like a man who took what he wanted, visually or otherwise. The storm is getting worse, he said. As if nothing had happened, as if on cue, the wind shrieked outside, battering the walls of the cottage. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the room plunged into darkness. Grace gasped. Stay put, Luca's voice came from the dark, calm and authoritative. She heard the strike of a match. A moment later, the fire in the hearth roared to life as he added more logs. The orange glow bathed the room in long, flickering shadows. Come sit, he ordered. It is going to be a long night. Grace moved to the sofa, sitting on the opposite end from him. The space between them felt charged, electric with the secrets they were both keeping. Luca poured more whiskey into his glass and offered the bottle to her. It helps, he said. Grace took the bottle and drank straight from it. The burn was welcome. So, Luca said, stretching his legs out, tell me why a beautiful woman is hiding from the world on Christmas Eve. Grace stared at the fire. The darkness made it easier to speak. The presence of a stranger, one who clearly operated outside the lines of polite society, made her own tragedy feel less like a burden and more like a fact. He died, she said simply. 6 months ago. Luca did not offer empty platitudes. He did not say he was sorry. He just nodded. How? Car accident, explosion. She turned the bottle in her hands. They said it was mechanical failure. I think they were lying. Luca went very still. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. Why do you think that? Because he was terrified in the weeks before it happened, Grace whispered. He was jumpy, paranoiac. He wouldn't tell me why. And then, boom. Luca took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving her. He seemed to be assembling a puzzle in his mind, piece by piece. Grief makes us see monsters in the shadows. Grace, sometimes bad things just happen. And sometimes bad people make them happen, she countered. He smiled then, but it did not reach his eyes. Yes, that is true too. He leaned back, the firelight carving sharp angles into his face. He looked dangerous, sitting there in her living room with his blood-stained shirt and his gun. She knew he had one. She'd felt the hardness of it under his jacket when she helped him, hidden from view. He was a predator, resting in her sanctuary. And yet, she did not feel the urge to run. She felt a strange, magnetic pull, a curiosity that outweighed her fear. He was the first thing that had felt real to her in 6 months. The wind howled again, shaking the window panes in their frames. The cottage felt small, isolated, a tiny boat adrift in a white ocean. Grace looked at him. "Are you in trouble, Luca?" "I'm always in trouble. Is someone looking for you?" "Probably." He swirled the whiskey. "Does that scare you?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. She looked at his hands, strong and capable, hands that could hurt or heal. "You are armed, aren't you?" "Yes." "Are you going to kill me?" The question hung in the air, stark and terrifying. Luca turned his head slowly to look at her. The firelight reflected in his dark irises, making them look like pools of molten obsidian. He let the silence stretch, testing her resolve, watching her pulse flutter in her throat. Then he laughed softly. It was a dark, intimate sound that shivered down her spine. "No, Angel," he said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. "I am not going to kill you, only if you beg me to." Grace stared at him. The words were a threat and a promise all at once. She shivered, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that it wasn't from the cold. Grace woke to the smell of wood smoke and the gray, heavy light of a storm that had refused to break. Her neck was stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle on the sofa, the woolen throw blanket twisted around her legs. For a disoriented moment, she expected the silence of the empty house, the usual crushing weight of another morning alone. Then she saw him. Luca was sitting in the armchair across from her, exactly where he had been the night before. He did not look like he had slept. His posture was rigid, alert, his dark eyes fixed on the window where the snow was piling up against the glass in thick, suffocating drifts. On the small side table next to his hand sat a gun. It was black, matte, and terrifyingly out of place next to her ceramic coasters. Grace sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The movement drew his attention. He turned his head, and the morning light caught the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, though it did nothing to soften the intensity of his gaze. "Good morning," he said. His voice was a rough scrape of sound, lower than she remembered. "You did not sleep," Grace stated, pushing her hair back from her face. "I do not sleep in strange houses," Luca replied. He picked up the gun and slid it into the waistband of his trousers in one fluid motion, hiding the violence away as if it were merely a wallet or a set of keys. "Especially not when I'm bleeding." Grace stood, feeling the chill of the room. The fire had burned down to embers. "I will make coffee and breakfast. You need to eat to replace the blood you lost." She retreated to the kitchen, needing the familiar ritual of grinding beans and cracking eggs to steady her shaking hands. But the sanctuary of her kitchen felt violated when Luca followed her a moment later. He leaned against the doorframe, filling the space, his presence making the room feel suddenly small and airless. He watched her move. He did not offer to help, nor did he look away. It was unnerving. "You are trying very hard," Luca observed, his voice cutting through the sound of sizzling butter. Grace flipped an egg, refusing to look at him. "I am making breakfast. It is what people do. It is what people do when they want to pretend everything is normal," he countered. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step closer. "You march around this house with your chin high and your shoulders square, playing the role of the strong, independent widow. But you are shaking." "Grace." Grace set the spatula down with a sharp clack against the counter. She turned to face him. "I took a stranger into my home in the middle of a blizzard. I cleaned his wounds. I am feeding him. I think I am handling this quite well." "You are handling it like a woman who is waiting for the floor to drop out from under her," Luca said. He moved closer, encroaching on her personal space until she had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. "You've been waiting for the disaster to strike for a long time, haven't you? Even before last night." "You do not know me," Grace snapped. "I know your type. You hold it all in. You think if you just stay quiet and follow the rules, the pain will stop." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, though he did not touch her. "You are drowning, Angel, and you are too proud to scream. Stop analyzing me," she warned, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And stop talking about my grief like you understand it. You know nothing about my husband." "I know he left you alone," Luca said, his voice dropping, becoming cruel in its honesty. I know he is dead and you are here, freezing in a cottage, pouring wine for a ghost." The anger flared white-hot in her chest, sudden and overwhelming, without thinking. Grace lashed out. Her palm connected with his cheek in a sharp, cracking slap that echoed in the kitchen. Silence crashed down instantly. Grace froze, horror washing over her. She had just struck a man who carried a gun, a man who had admitted he was dangerous. She stared at the red mark blooming on his skin, her breath catching in her throat. Luca did not recoil. He did not yell. Slowly, he turned his face back to hers. His eyes were dark, burning with a fire that had nothing to do with anger. He stepped in, closing the final inch between them. Grace backed up until her hips hit the counter, trapping her. Luca leaned down, his face so close to hers that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He brought his mouth to hers, hovering a breath away. She could taste the whiskey on him from the night before, mixed with the danger he wore like a second skin. She trembled, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, waiting. She expected violence. She expected him to take it. Instead, he brushed his lips against hers, a feather-light contact that was more shocking than a bruise. It was a taunt, a question, a test of her resolve. He stayed there for a heartbeat, inhaling her sharp intake of breath, letting the tension stretch until it was a physical thing binding them together. Then, he pulled back. He stepped away, putting 2 feet of distance between them. He ran a hand through his hair, looking at the floor, and let out a long, ragged exhale. "I apologize," he said roughly. Grace blinked, stunned. The air around them was still vibrating. "What? I should not have pushed you," Luca said, his voice controlled again, the predator leashed. "And I should not have done that. It was undisciplined." He looked at her then, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone. In its place was a flicker of regret, something human and weary. "The eggs are burning," he said quietly. Grace turned back to the stove, her hands shaking so badly she could barely salvage the meal. They ate in silence, the only sound the scraping of forks against ceramic. But the dynamic had shifted, the fear had receded, replaced by a confused, simmering awareness. By early afternoon, the temperature inside the cottage had dropped significantly. The power lines were clearly down for miles, and the fire was no longer enough to battle the creeping frost. "Do you have a generator?" Luca asked, standing by the window and watching the whiteout conditions. "In the shed out back," Grace said, "but it has not been run in 2 years. I do not know if it works." "Show me." They bundled up in coats and scarves and braved the wind. The shed was freezing, smelling of gasoline and old oil. The generator sat in the corner, a hulking beast of metal covered in a layer of dust. For the next hour, they worked side by side. Grace held the flashlight while Luca worked on the engine. She watched his hands, large, scarred, and surprisingly dexterous, as they manipulated the small tools. He knew exactly what he was doing. He stripped the carburetor with efficient, practiced movements, explaining the process to her in short, clipped sentences. "Hold this," he would say, handing her a bolt, or "light here." There was no condescension in his tone. He treated her as a capable partner. When a rusted nut refused to budge, he didn't curse or force it with blind rage. He applied steady, calculated pressure, his jaw set in concentration. She saw the sharp intelligence behind his brute strength. He was a man who understood how things worked, how to fix what was broken, and how to dismantle what was in his way. At one point, he winced, his hand going to the wound at his side. "You are hurting," Grace said, stepping closer. "It is fine," he grunted. "Luca, let me do the choke," she insisted, reaching past him. He paused, looking at her. Then he stepped back, allowing her to take over the final step. When the engine finally roared to life, sputtering smoke before settling into a loud, rhythmic chug, a rare, genuine smile broke across his face. It transformed him. The hardness melted away for a second, revealing the man he might have been in a different life. "Good work, Grace," he said. The praise warmed her more than the heater ever could. They returned to the house, stomping snow off their boots. The lights flickered on. casting a warm, yellow glow over the living room. The hum of the furnace kicking in was the most beautiful sound Grace had heard in months. But as the afternoon wore on, the snow did not stop. It fell thicker, heavier, burying the world. Luca stood by the window again, his phone in his hand. He had been trying to make a call for an hour, but the signal was dead. "You should try to sleep," Grace said, coming up behind him. "The roads will not be clear until tomorrow at the earliest." Luca turned. His face was grim, the earlier lightness from the shed completely gone. "I cannot leave tomorrow." "Grace, what do you mean?" "I mean, the roads are not the only problem." He looked at the phone, then shoved it into his pocket. "Someone is looking for me. A rival crew. They know I am in this area. If I go out there now, on open roads, I am a dead man." Grace felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "So you are staying? Hiding here? I have to—" "And what about me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You are dragging me into this. If they find you here—" "They will not find me," he interrupted. "I covered my tracks." "You crashed a car into a snowbank," Grace shouted. "How is that covering your tracks? You are dangerous. Luca, I knew it the moment I saw you. You have brought your war to my doorstep?" "You are already in the war, sweetheart," Luca said softly. The nickname was not a taunt this time. It was heavy with pity. Grace stopped. "What?" Luca sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. He walked over to the fireplace and leaned against the mantel, looking down at the flames. "Your husband, Mark. What about him?" Grace whispered. "He was not an accountant," Luca said, not looking at her. "Well, he was. But not for a firm. He worked for the chaotic side of the city. He moved money. I cleaned it. He worked for the people who are hunting me now." Grace shook her head, a numb denial spreading through her limbs. "No, that is ridiculous. Mark he was boring. He was safe. He was stealing from them," Luca continued relentlessly. "Skimming off the top. He thought he was smarter than them. He thought they wouldn't notice a few % here and there. But they always notice." He turned to face her. "The explosion on the highway? It wasn't an accident and it wasn't random. It was a message, and it was a punishment." The world tilted on its axis. Grace reached out, gripping the back of the sofa to keep from falling. The pieces slammed together in her mind. The late nights, the sudden influx of cash he claimed was a bonus, the terrifying paranoia in his final weeks, the way he checked the locks 3 times a night. He knew?" she choked out. "He knew he was going to die." "He knew he was caught," Luca said. "He was trying to buy his way out." "But you don't buy your way out of that life." Grace made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Her legs gave out. She didn't hit the floor. Luca was there in an instant, moving with that terrifying speed. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her up. He pulled her against his chest, his grip hard and unyielding. "I am sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I am sorry you had to know." Grace buried her face in his shirt, sobbing. She cried for the husband she had lost, and she cried for the stranger she had married, the man who had lied to her every single day. She cried for the danger she was in, and the terrifying realization that her entire life for the last 3 years had been built on a foundation of criminal secrets. Luca held her through it all. He did not shush her. He did not offer false comforts. He simply stood there, a solid wall of heat and strength, absorbing her grief. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, pressing her closer to him. It was protective, yes, but there was tension in it too, a possession. He was holding her as if he was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. Hours later, the house was quiet again. Grace could not sleep. Her bedroom felt too large, too full of the ghosts Luca had summoned. Every shadow looked like an accusation. Every creak of the house sounded like an intruder. She got up, wrapping her silk robe tightly around her waist, and walked barefoot into the living room. The fire was low, casting a deep red glow over the room. Luca was sitting on the rug before the hearth, cleaning his gun. He had taken it apart, the metal components laid out on a cloth. He reassembled it by feel. his eyes fixed on the flames. He heard her approach but did not turn. Grace sat down on the sofa behind him. She watched his back, the broad expanse of his shoulders, the way the muscles shifted as he worked. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the truth. "He never told me," she said softly into the darkness. Luca slid the magazine back into the weapon with a sharp click. Men like that. They think they are protecting you by lying. They think if you do not know the sin, you will not be stained by it. Was he a bad man? Luca turned then, shifting his body so he could look up at her. He was a weak man who got greedy. Does that make him bad? That is for you to decide. Grace looked at him. This killer, this criminal who had told her the truth when the man she loved had only given her lies. "I feel like I am mourning a stranger." "Then stop mourning," Luca said. The command hung in the air between them. "It is not that simple," she whispered. "He was my husband. I belonged to him." Luca stood up. He moved slowly, approaching the sofa until he was standing over her. The firelight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the darkness of his eyes. He looked down at her, and the air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, suffocating intensity. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the line of her jaw, his touch rough and calloused against her soft skin. "He is gone." "Grace," Luca whispered, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "He left you behind in a mess of his own making. You do not owe him your tears anymore." His thumb brushed her lower lip, pulling it down slightly. Grace stopped breathing. "And you do not owe the dead your body anymore," he said. Grace stared up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The grief was still there, a bruised ache in her chest, but beneath it, something else was waking up, something hot and reckless and alive. She looked at the man who had brought danger into her home, and for the first time in 6 months, she did not feel alone. She felt seen. And she felt terrified of how much she wanted him to keep touching her. The revelation about Mark hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire, acrid and choking. Grace moved through the cottage with a ghost-like drift, touching familiar objects, a vase, a framed photograph, the spine of a book, as if testing to see if they were still real. Her entire life felt like a stage set constructed by a man she had never truly known, a backdrop for crimes she could not comprehend. Luca watched her from the armchair. He had not moved much since the morning, conserving his strength, but his eyes followed her every step. He was a predator resting, lethal and silent. Yet his presence was the only solid thing in her world right now. Grace stopped by the window. The snow was still falling, a relentless white wall burying them alive. She turned to look at him, her curiosity cutting through the numbness. "How many?" she asked. Her voice was quiet but steady. Luca looked up from the magazine of his gun, which he had been idly loading and unloading. He did not pretend to misunderstand her. "How many, what, Grace?" "People?" she said. "How many people have you killed?" A normal man would have flinched. He would have stuttered, made excuses, or lied to protect the delicate sensibilities of a suburban widow. Luca did none of those things. He held her gaze, his face impassive, though a shadow seemed to darken his irises. 22, he answered. The number was spoken without pride, but also without shame. It was a fact. Cold and hard as the ice on the windows. Grace felt a tremor run through her hands, but she balled them into fists at her sides. She should have been terrified. She was standing in her living room with a mass murderer. By all rights, she should be running into the storm to escape him. But the fear did not come. Instead, a strange, morbid fascination took root in her chest. Mark had killed people, too, indirectly, with his greed and his cowardice. At least Luca looked her in the eye when he admitted his sins. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "Remembering them?" "I remember the faces of the ones who deserved it," Luca said, his voice low. "And I remember the faces of the ones who did not. The rest are just work." "And which one am I?" Grace asked, stepping closer to him. "Am I working, or do I deserve it?" Luca stood up then, the movement sudden and fluid. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, towering over her. "You are neither," he said roughly. "You are a mistake. You are an innocent woman caught in the blast radius of a war you did not start, and I intend to keep you that way." He reached behind him, pulling the gun from his waistband. He held it out to her. "Handle first." The black metal seemed to suck the light from the room. "Take it," he ordered. Grace stared at the weapon. "I hate guns." "I know," Luca said. "But hate will not stop a bullet. If they come for me, Grace, they come for you too. You need to know how to use this. Just in case." Grace let out a short, bitter laugh. It sounded jagged in the quiet room. "My husband was an accountant who laundered money for the mob, and now a hitman is handing me a pistol in my own kitchen. It is quite the Christmas story." "Take it," he repeated. His tone brooked nothing of refusal. Grace reached out. The gun was heavier than she expected. Cold and dense in her palm, it felt alien, an object of death invading her sanctuary. "Two hands," Luca instructed. He moved behind her, his chest pressing against her back. The heat of his body was a shock against the chill of the house. He reached around, his large, calloused hands covering hers, guiding her grip. "Thumbs forward. Do not cross them behind the slide, or it will take the skin off your knuckles." Grace tried to focus on his instructions, but her senses were overwhelmed by him. The scent of leather and wood smoke, the hard wall of muscle against her spine, the rough texture of his palms against her soft skin. He adjusted her stance, his hands lingering on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before moving to her shoulders. "Feet apart," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "Lean into it. If you fire, it will kick. You have to be ready." Grace raised the gun, aiming at the far wall above the fireplace. Her arms trembled. "Steady," Luca whispered. His voice was a vibration against her back. "Breathe out, squeeze, do not pull." She dry-fired the weapon. The click was loud in the silence. "Good," Luca said. He did not step away. Grace lowered the gun, but she did not move away either. She leaned back, just an inch, allowing the contact between them to deepen. For a moment, they stood frozen in the tableau of violence and protection. "I hope I never have to use it," she whispered. "So do I, Angel," Luca replied, his voice thick. "So do I." Later that afternoon, the domesticity of their entrapment took a surreal turn. Luca had found a stain of blood on his shirt, the one he had worn when he crashed, that had soaked through the bandages earlier. He was attempting to scrub it out in the small basin of her laundry room sink. Grace found him there, shirtless, the muscles of his back flexing as he worked the fabric under the cold water. The sight of him stopped her in the doorway. His skin was a map of violence, scarred and marked, but he was beautiful in a brutal, classical way. He looked like a statue that had been broken and put back together with gold. "Let me," she said, stepping into the room. Luca paused, looking over his shoulder. "I can manage." "You will reopen your stitches," Grace said, moving to the sink. She gently nudged him aside. To her surprise, he yielded. She plunged her hands into the icy water, taking the fabric from him. They stood side by side in the cramped space, their arms brushing with every movement. The air grew heavy, charged with the unspoken things that had been building between them for 24 hours. Grace scrubbed at the dark stain, watching the water turn pink. "Why do you do it?" she asked softly. "This life." "It was the only door open," Luca said. He was watching her profile, his gaze intense. "I grew up with nothing. They offered me everything, loyalty, respect, power." "And now?" Grace asked, turning to look at him. "Is it worth it? Being hunted like an animal in the snow?" "It was," Luca said. "Until yesterday." Grace's breath hitched. She looked up at him, water dripping from her hands unnoticed. "What changed yesterday?" Luca did not answer with words. He reached out, his wet hand cupping her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch reverent, almost disbelieving. Grace leaned into his palm, her eyes fluttering shut. A small sound escaped her throat, a whimper of need that she could not suppress. She pressed her body against his. Her hands came up to rest on his bare chest, her fingers splaying over the hard pectoral muscles, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart beneath the skin. It was beating fast, just like hers. Luca groaned low in his throat. His other hand came up to grip her waist, pulling her flush against him. The damp shirt fell into the sink with a splash. He lowered his head, his mouth hovering inches from hers. Grace rose on her tiptoes, seeking him, desperate to close the gap. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to consume her. But at the last second, Luca pulled back. He wrenched himself away from her, gripping the edge of the sink until his knuckles turned white. His breathing was ragged, harsh in the quiet room. "Luca?" she whispered, confused and aching. He did not look at her. He stared at the wall, his jaw clenched tight enough to snap. "If I kiss you now," he rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass, "I will not stop. I will take you right here, against this sink, and I will not be gentle about it." Grace stared at his back, her blood singing in her veins. "Maybe I do not want you to stop." Luca turned then, his eyes blazing with a mixture of desire and restraint. "You are grieving. Grace, you are confused, and I am. I am not a man who takes advantage of vulnerable women. Go." He pointed to the door. "Go, before I change my mind." Grace fled, but she did not run from fear. She ran because she knew he was right, and she hated him for it. And more than that, she hated that she wanted him to change his mind. Night fell early, bringing a darkness so absolute it felt weighty. The generator chugged faithfully in the distance. But Grace left the lamps off. She preferred the firelight. It felt primal. It felt appropriate for the decision she had made. She stood in her bedroom, looking at herself in the mirror. She had showered, washing away the scent of the old Grace, the grieving widow. She applied a touch of perfume to her throat and wrists. Then, she reached into the back of her drawer and pulled out a garment she had never worn for Mark. It was a floor-length nightgown of champagne-colored silk, suspended by thin spaghetti straps. It skimmed her curves like liquid water, hiding nothing and promising everything. She pulled a heavy velvet robe over it, tying the belt loosely. She was done with the past. She was done with the ghost of a husband who had sold his soul for money. She was alive. She was here. And there was a man in her living room who looked at her as if she were the only source of warmth in a frozen world. Grace walked into the living room. Luca was sitting on the rug before the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as she entered, and the glass paused halfway to his mouth. He went very still. Grace walked over to the hearth. She did not sit in the chair. She sat on the rug, close enough to him that the heat of his body radiated toward her. She reached for the bottle of whiskey and poured a splash into her own glass. She took a sip, the amber liquid burning a path down her throat. She set the glass down and turned to face him. "I am not confused. Luca?" she said. Luca set his glass down with deliberate care. He turned his body fully toward her. The firelight danced over his features, highlighting the sharp cheekbones and the intense, hungry darkness of his eyes. "Grace," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "I do not want to talk about the weather," she said, cutting him off. "And I do not want to talk about the men who are hunting you. I want to talk about us." "There is no us," Luca said, though the words lacked conviction. "I leave in the morning. If we survive, then we have tonight," Grace whispered. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his knee. The muscle beneath the fabric jumped at her touch. "I have spent 6 months feeling like I died in that explosion too. I am cold, Luca, everywhere. I want to feel something again." She looked him dead in the eye, letting all her grief and her need and her anger bleed into her gaze. "Make me forget the funeral. Make me forget him." Luca stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He seemed to be warring with himself, his honor battling his instinct. He looked at her hand on his knee, then up to her face, searching for any sign of hesitation. He found none. "Say it," he demanded. His voice was husky, stripped of all pretense. "If this is what you want, Grace, you have to say it, clearly, so there are no mistakes." Grace took a breath. She untied the belt of her robe, letting the velvet fall open to reveal the shimmering silk beneath. "I want you, Luca. I want you to touch me." Something in Luca snapped. The restraint shattered. "Come here," he growled. He reached out and pulled her toward him. Grace went willingly, moving into the circle of his arms. He did not kiss her immediately. Instead, his hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her dizzy. "You are sure?" he asked one last time, his gaze searching her soul. "Yes," she breathed. He lowered his head and captured her mouth. It was not a tentative brush of lips this time. It was a claim. His mouth was hot and demanding, tasting of whiskey and fire. Grace opened to him with a gasp, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry thing. He tasted like danger, but he felt like life. Luca's hands moved down her throat, over her shoulders, pushing the robe from her body until it pooled on the rug behind her. He broke the kiss to look at her, his gaze traveling down the length of her body in the silk gown. The appreciation in his eyes was raw and worshipful. "Beautiful," he murmured against her skin as he trailed kisses down the column of her neck. "You are so beautiful, Grace." He began to unbutton the bodice of the gown. His movements were slow, agonizingly deliberate. He never broke eye contact, watching her reaction to every inch of skin he revealed. Grace trembled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The fire popped and crackled beside them, but the heat between them was far more intense. When the silk slid away, Luca did not rush. He treated her body as if it were a sacred thing, something to be revered. His large, rough hands mapped her curves with a tenderness that belied his violent nature. He touched her as if he were memorizing her, learning the language of her skin. Grace arched into him, a sob catching in her throat, not of sadness but of overwhelming relief. The numbness that had encased her for months shattered. She felt everything. The roughness of his fingertips, the weight of his body pressing her down onto the thick rug, the friction of skin against skin. "Luca." She whispered his name like a prayer. "I have you," he swore, his voice guttural against her ear. "I have you, Angel. Let go." And she did. They made love in the glow of the firelight, the storm raging impotently outside the walls. It was slow and intense, a desperate conversation of bodies. Every touch was a reassurance, every movement a promise. Grace cried out, the sound torn from her by a pleasure so sharp it bordered on pain, and Luca was there to catch the sound with his mouth. He anchored her, his strength becoming her shelter. It was not just physical, it was an exorcism. With every thrust, he drove away the ghosts of the past. With every kiss, he rewrote the history of her body. Grace clung to him, her nails digging into his shoulders, feeling the scars on his back, accepting the darkness in him because it matched the darkness in her. For a long time, there was only the sound of their breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, stifled cries of release. Afterward, the silence returned. But it was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Grace lay curled against Luca's side, her head resting on his chest. He had pulled the velvet robe and the throw blanket over them, creating a warm cocoon. His arm was wrapped tightly around her, his hand idly stroking her hair. Grace listened to his heartbeat as it slowed to a steady, powerful rhythm. She felt exhausted, drained in the best possible way. For the first time in half a year, her mind was quiet. She traced a finger over a scar on his ribs, feeling a profound sense of connection to this man who had fallen from the sky and crashed into her life. "I'm glad you came," she whispered into the darkness. "I am glad you crashed." Luca tightened his arm around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "So am I." He shifted slightly, reaching for the glass of water on the hearth. As he sat up, his body went rigid against hers. Grace felt the change instantly. The relaxed warmth vanished, replaced by the tension of a coiled spring. "Luca?" He did not answer. He was staring at the window. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, but a sliver of glass was visible at the edge. Through it, the swirling snow was illuminated by a faint, sweeping beam of light. It was not the moon. It was too focused, too deliberate. Headlights. They cut through the darkness of the front yard, sweeping across the front of the cottage before extinguishing abruptly. Luca moved. He was off the floor in a second, crouching low, ignoring his nakedness. He reached for the gun that lay on the table, racking the slide with a terrifyingly familiar click. "Grace," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had been there only moments ago. It was the voice of the killer again. "Get down, stay low." Grace sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, her heart plummeting from the heights of passion into the depths of terror. "What is it?" Luca crept toward the window, pressing himself against the wall to peer through the crack in the curtains. He watched for a second, then turned back to her. His face was grim, a mask of stone in the dying firelight. "They have found me," he said quietly. The peace of the night shattered, replaced by the cold reality of the war waiting outside. The peace of the cabin had been a fragile illusion, and the headlights cutting through the darkness outside shattered it completely. Luca moved with a speed that was terrifying to behold. One moment he was the tender lover holding her in the afterglow of intimacy, and the next he was a soldier. His body coiled with lethal intent. He was already pulling on his trousers, his movements sharp and efficient, the gun never leaving his reach. "Get dressed," he ordered. His voice had dropped an octave, stripping away all the softness he had shown her by the fire. "Shoes, coat, now!" Grace scrambled up from the rug, clutching her robe to her chest. The cold air of the room hit her skin, but the chill inside her veins was far worse. "Who are they? You said you covered your tracks." "I did," Luca said, dragging his sweater over his head. "But the Valentini crew has eyes everywhere. They must have picked up the car on a traffic cam before the storm hit. They have been sweeping the grid." He moved to the window, flattening himself against the wall to peer through the crack in the curtains. The headlights outside had vanished, extinguished as quickly as they had appeared, which was somehow more frightening. It meant they were no longer looking. It meant they had found what they wanted. "We have to run," Grace whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled on her jeans. "The wood's behind the house. If we leave now, we can lose them in the trees." Luca turned to her, his expression hard. "No. Look outside. Grace, the snow is 3 feet deep and drifting higher. You would make it 100 yards before the cold took you, or before they tracked your footprints like a wounded deer. Out there, we're slow and exposed. Here, I control the angles." "But we are trapped," Grace cried, panic rising in her throat. "We are fortified," Luca corrected. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Listen to me. You are safer with me in this room than you are anywhere else on Earth right now. Do you understand?" Grace looked into his eyes. They were dark, fierce, and utterly focused. He was not afraid. He was calculating. She nodded, the motion jerky. "I understand." "Good." He released her. "Get the gun I gave you. Load it. Do not tremble." Grace ran to the bedroom where she had left the heavy pistol. Her fingers felt like blocks of ice as she fumbled with the magazine. She remembered his lessons from earlier, the weight, the slide, the safety. She forced the magazine home with a solid click and racked the slide. When she returned to the living room, Luca was already transforming the space. He had flipped the heavy oak table onto its side, creating a barricade facing the front door. He was currently dragging the sofa across the room to block the hallway entrance. "My phone," he said, not looking up from his labor. "I have a signal booster in the car, but I cannot get to it. I need your landline. Does it work?" "Usually," Grace said. She grabbed the cordless handset from the kitchen counter. There was a dial tone. She handed it to him. Luca dialed a number from memory, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the room. He waited, his jaw tight. "Dante, it is me. I am burned. Yes, the farmhouse off Route 9. 2, maybe 3 vehicles, Valentini's men. I need a cleanup crew." He listened for a moment, his face darkening. 12 hours. The plows won't be through until noon. "I don't care about the plows. Get a chopper if you have to." "Fine. Get here when you can." He hung up and threw the phone onto the couch. 12 hours, Grace asked, her voice small. "The storm has grounded everything," Luca said, checking the load in his own weapon. My men are coming, but they have to cut through the same blizzard that trapped us. We are on our own until morning. Can we hold them off for that long?" Luca looked at her, and for a second the mask slipped. He looked tired. "We have to—" The next few hours were an agony of waiting. The attack did not come immediately. The men outside were professionals. They knew the terrain was against them, too. They were waiting for the wind to die down, or for the occupants to make a mistake, or simply for the psychological weight of the siege to break them. Inside, the cottage became a pressure cooker. Luca extinguished all the lights, plunging the house into darkness save for the dying embers of the fire, which he allowed to fade to a dull red glow. They sat in the shadows, listening to the wind howl. Every branch scraping against the siding sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a door opening. Grace sat with her back against the overturned table, the gun heavy in her lap. Luca paced the perimeter like a caged tiger, moving from window to window, checking the sight lines. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a potent mixture of terror and adrenaline. The fear was an aphrodisiac. It sharpened the senses, making everything vivid and immediate. Grace watched Luca move, the prowling grace of his body, the lethal competence in his hands, and she felt a surge of desire that was almost painful. It was irrational. It was madness. But the proximity of death made the need to feel life burn brighter. Luca stopped pacing. He sensed her eyes on him. He walked over to where she sat and crouched down, his face inches from hers in the dark. "You are staring," he murmured. "I am scared," she admitted, "and I am angry, and I don't want to die without touching you again." Luca's eyes flared. The tension that had been winding tight between them all night snapped. He reached out, his hand tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck, and pulled her to him. This was not the slow, worshipful lovemaking of earlier. This was desperate. It was rough. It was a collision of two people standing on the edge of a cliff. He pulled her up from the floor, backing her against the wall beside the window. The glass was freezing against her skin, a shock of cold that contrasted violently with the searing heat of his body pressing into hers. Outside, the snow swirled in a white vortex, a silent witness to their frantic union. "Luca!" she gasped. His name tearing from her throat, he kissed her hard, devouring the sound. His hands were everywhere, gripping her waist, her hips, possessing her with a ferocity that bordered on violence. There was no gentleness left in him, only a raw, driving need to claim her, to mark her, to prove that they were still breathing. Grace met him with equal force. She dug her nails into his shoulders, wrapping her legs around him, anchoring herself to him. She needed his weight. She needed his strength. She needed the pain and the pleasure to drown out the fear of what was waiting in the dark. Her moans were stifled against the heavy wool of his sweater, lost in the roar of the wind and the pounding of her own blood. They moved together against the cold window pane, a frantic rhythm of life in the face of death. When the end came, it was explosive, a shattering release that left them both gasping and clinging to each other in the darkness, their hearts hammering in unison. Luca held her there for a long time, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing slowly returning to normal. He did not let go. He kept her pinned against the wall as if his body could shield her from the reality of the world. "I should not have done that," he rasped, his voice rough. "I should be watching the door." "You are watching," Grace whispered, running her hand down his arm. "You see everything." They slid down to the floor, sitting huddled together in the corner, away from the direct line of sight of the window. The intimacy had shifted again. The frantic heat had cooled into a somber, heavy bond. They were no longer just lovers or strangers. They were partners in a foxhole. "Tell me," Grace said softly, breaking the silence. "You said before that you trusted no one, that you learned your lesson." Luca stared into the shadows. Her name was Elena. Grace waited. She knew this cost him. "We grew up together in the neighborhood," Luca said, his voice devoid of emotion, which made the story sadder. "She was the only soft thing in a hard world. I thought she was my redemption. I thought if she loved me, I could not be entirely damned. What happened? I was young. I was rising fast in the organization. I told her things I should not have, where I was going, who I was meeting. He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. She sold me, for a visa and $10,000. She told a rival family where to find me. They put 2 bullets in my chest and left me in a gutter. Grace reached out, finding his hand in the dark. She squeezed it. I survived, Lucas said. Obviously. And I learned, love is a leverage. It is a weakness they use to pry you open. Is that what I am? Grace asked. A weakness? Luca turned his head, looking at her in the gloom. No. You are something else. Something I did not account for. Mark betrayed me, too, Grace said quietly. Not with a bullet, but with 1,000 small lies. He sold our safety for money. He sold my trust for his own ego. Then we are a matching set, Luca murmured. 2 people standing in the ruins of the people who were supposed to love us. He squeezed her hand back, his grip crushing. It was a moment of absolute vulnerability, a shared recognition of their damage. In that dark, cold room, surrounded by enemies, they forged a bond that was stronger than the physical passion they had shared. It was a bond of survival. The crack of the gunshot was louder than thunder. It shattered the moment and the window simultaneously. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the floor like diamonds. The wind roared into the room, carrying the biting cold and the smell of gunpowder. Down! Luca roared. He threw himself over her, driving them both flat to the floorboards as a second shot punched through the wall where they had been standing minutes ago. Stay low, he commanded. He rolled off her, moving on his belly toward the overturned table. Crawl to the kitchen, keep your head down. Grace scrambled across the floor, the glass slicing into her palms, but she did not feel it. Her heart was a frantic bird battering against her ribs. She reached the kitchen doorway and pressed herself behind the refrigerator, clutching the gun he had given her with white-knuckled desperation. Luca was at the barricade. He did not fire blindly. He waited. He was a statue in the chaos. Another shot rang out, shattering a vase on the mantelpiece, then another. They were suppressing fire, keeping Luca pinned while they advanced. 3 of them, Luca shouted over the wind. Coming from the tree line. He rose up, swift as a striking cobra. He fired 2 shots in rapid succession, bang, bang, and then ducked back down. A scream tore through the night outside, cut short abruptly. 1 down, Luca gritted out. He moved then, abandoning the safety of the barricade. He knew they would flank him. He knew the house was a trap if he stayed static. Luca, no! Grace screamed as he moved toward the shattered window. He ignored her. He vaulted over the sill, disappearing into the swirling white void of the storm. Grace sat paralyzed, listening to the sounds of war in her front yard. The wind howled, masking the footsteps, but the gunshots were unmistakable. There was a flurry of fire, rapid, chaotic, and then silence. She waited, counting the heartbeats. 1, 2, 10. A shadow loomed in the broken window. Grace raised her gun, her finger tightening on the trigger. It is me! Luca's voice came, breathless and strained. He climbed back inside. He was covered in snow, and there was a dark smear of blood on his face that was not his own. He limped slightly as he dropped to the floor, reloading his weapon with trembling hands. I got the second one, he said, wiping the blood from his eyes. He was trying to circle around to the back door. Are you hurt? Grace crawled toward him, scanning his body for wounds. I am fine, he said, though he flinched when she touched his side. But there are more. I saw the headlights of a second car coming up the drive just before I came in. They are bringing reinforcements. Grace felt the walls closing in. The cold was seeping into her bones. The reality of their situation was a heavy weight on her chest. We cannot hold them off forever. Luca, I know. Run, she begged, grabbing his arm. You said your men are coming. If you leave now, you can hide in the woods. They want you, not me. If you are gone, they will leave me alone. Luca looked at her, and the look on his face broke her heart. It was fierce, protective, and devastatingly final. They will not leave you alone, Grace, he said softly. You have seen my face. You have seen them. They leave no loose ends. If I run, you die. If I stay, we both might die. But at least I can make them pay for every inch." He leaned in, grabbing the back of her neck, and pressed his forehead against hers. His skin was freezing, but his breath was hot. "Listen to me," he said, his voice intense. "This is the end game. They are going to rush the house. I am going to hold the front room." He pulled back to look her in the eye. "If they get past me, if you see a man come through that door who is not me, you shoot him. You do not hesitate, you shoot him in the chest, and you keep shooting until the gun is empty." "Luca, please." Tears streamed down her face. "And then," he continued, ignoring her pleas, "you run, you go out the back window. You run north, toward the highway. Do not look back, do not stop for anything. Do you understand?" Grace sobbed, shaking her head. "I can't leave you. You have to," Luca said. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, desperate seal of a promise. "Because if you die here, Grace, then I have died for nothing. Save yourself. That is how you save me." He stood up, turning his back on her to face the shattered window and the approaching darkness. He raised his weapon, ready to meet the storm. "Get to the kitchen," he ordered, his voice turning to steel. "And wait for my signal." Grace scrambled back, gripping her gun, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She watched his broad back, the only thing standing between her and the abyss, and prayed for a miracle that she knew was not coming. The dawn did not bring the sun. It brought a gray, suffocating light that filtered through the storm clouds, turning the world into a landscape of charcoal and bone. Inside the cottage, the waiting ended with the sudden, deafening roar of an engine revving in the driveway, followed by the sickening crunch of wood splintering. They had rammed the front porch. "Go!" Luca roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Basement now!" He shoved Grace toward the narrow door in the hallway, his eyes wild and hard, stripped of all the tenderness they had held hours before. Grace stumbled, gripping the heavy pistol with sweaty hands, but she did not argue. She threw herself down the wooden stairs, the darkness of the cellar swallowing her whole as the world above erupted into violence. She huddled in the corner behind the old furnace, her knees pulled to her chest, the cold concrete seeping through her jeans. Above her, the floorboards vibrated with the heavy thud of boots. Glass shattered, not just one window, but all of them. A cascade of destruction that sounded like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Gunfire erupted, a rhythmic, terrifying staccato that echoed through the vents. It sounded like the house was being torn apart by wolves. Grace pressed her hands over her ears, but she could not block out the screams. They were guttural, wet sounds of men dying. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing Luca alone in that living room, a singular force of nature standing against the tide. "Please," she prayed to a God she hadn't spoken to in 6 months, "please let him be the one left standing." Something heavy crashed directly above her head, shaking dust from the rafters. Then, silence. It was a thick, heavy silence that was worse than the noise. Grace lowered her hands, her breath hitching in her throat. She waited for Luca's voice. She waited for the all clear. Instead, she heard the creak of the basement door opening. Grace scrambled back, wedging herself deeper into the shadows. Footsteps descended the stairs. They were slow, heavy, searching. "Come out, little bird," a voice rasped. It was not Luca. It was a stranger's voice, thick with a cruel anticipation. "We know you are down here. Luca is done. Come out and maybe we can make it quick." Grace stopped breathing. The man reached the bottom of the stairs. The beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, sweeping over the boxes of old decorations, the rusted tools, the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The beam moved closer to her hiding spot. She remembered what Luca had told her. 2 hands, lean into it, don't hesitate. The flashlight swung onto her. Grace was blinded by the glare, but she saw the outline of a large man raising a weapon. She didn't think so. Instinct, primal and terrified, took over. She raised the gun, squeezed her eyes shut, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. The recoil jarred her arms all the way to her shoulders. A sound of shock, a sharp, punched-out exhale, followed by a heavy thud. Grace opened her eyes. The flashlight lay rolling on the floor, casting erratic shadows against the wall. The man was crumpled on the concrete 6 feet away, clutching his stomach. Dark blood was already pooling beneath his fingers. He looked at her with wide, disbelief-filled eyes, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Grace dropped the gun, her hands shaking so violently she could barely feel them. She scrambled backward, a sob tearing from her throat. She had done it. She had taken a life. The horror of it washed over her, cold and nauseating, but beneath the bile was a fierce, burning realization. She was alive. She did not stay to watch him die. She grabbed the gun from the floor. Luca had told her to keep shooting, but she couldn't. She couldn't do it again and ran for the stairs. She flew up them, bursting into the hallway. The house was a ruin. The overturned table was splintered, the walls riddled with holes that let in the biting wind. Furniture was overturned, lamps shattered. It looked like a hurricane had birthed a war zone inside her living room. "Luca!" she screamed, the name tearing at her throat. There was no answer. She ran to the front door, which was hanging off its hinges. The cold air hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled out into the porch, slipping on the casing shells that littered the wood. The front yard was a graveyard of snow and metal. 2 black SUVs sat idling, their windshields shattered. Bodies lay in the snow, dark shapes against the white, motionless. Grace scanned the scene frantically. Then she saw him. Luca was crouched by the front bumper of the nearest SUV, one hand bracing himself against the metal, the other still gripping his gun. There was a body at his feet, the last of them. "Luca!" She ran to him, the snow crunching under her boots. He turned his head slowly at the sound of her name. His face was gray, drained of all color, his lips almost blue. "Grace," he whispered. The gun slipped from his fingers and fell into the snow. He collapsed. Grace dove forward, catching him before he hit the ground fully. He was dead weight. Heavy and limp, she fell with him, her knees sinking into the drift. "No, no, no!" she chanted, frantic. She grabbed his shoulders, turning him over. The entire left side of his sweater was soaked in blood. It was dark, sticky, and warm, too warm against the freezing air. He had been hit, badly. "I got them," he murmured, his eyes unfocused, staring up at the gray sky. "I got them all. You are okay," Grace lied, her tears freezing on her face. "You are going to be okay. We need to get you inside. It is too cold." She grabbed him under the arms. He groaned, a sound of pure agony that cut through her heart. But she didn't stop. She hauled him backward, her boots slipping on the ice, straining with every ounce of strength she possessed. Adrenaline gave her power she didn't know she had. She dragged him foot by agonizing foot, up the stairs, across the ruined porch, and into the hallway. She left a broad smear of crimson on the pristine white snow behind them. She got him as far as the rug in front of the dying fire. She collapsed beside him, her lungs burning. Luca's breathing was shallow, wet and rattling. "The phone," he rasped. "Call!" Grace scrambled for the handset. Miraculously, it had survived the chaos. She dialed the number he had made her memorize, her fingers slipping on the buttons. It rang once, twice. "Status!" a voice barked on the other end. "He is hurt," Grace sobbed. "He is dying. You have to come now. Please." "Who is this?" "Grace, I am with Luca. He's bleeding out. The farmhouse on Route 9. Please. We are 5 miles out." "Wah!" the voice. Dante swore. "The roads are blocked with drifts. We are coming. Lady, keep pressure on it. Do not let him sleep." Grace dropped the phone. She ripped the throw blanket from the sofa and pressed it against Luca's side. He cried out, his back arching off the floor, his hand gripping her wrist with bruising force. "I'm sorry," she wept, pressing harder. "I am sorry. I have to—" "It is okay," he breathed, his grip weakening, his eyes fluttered shut. "No!" Grace slapped his cheek lightly. "Look at me. Luca, look at me. You do not get to sleep. You do not get to leave me here alone with this." He opened his eyes, struggling to focus on her face. A faint, crooked smile touched his lips. "You shot him," he whispered. "I heard it. You did good, Angel. I hated it, she said, choking on a sob. Good, he murmured. Hold on to that. Minutes turned into hours, or maybe seconds. Grace lost track of time. She only knew the rhythm of his breathing, the terrifying heat of his blood on her hands, and the way the light was slowly fading from his eyes. She talked to him. She told him about her garden. She told him about the time she broke her arm in 3rd grade. She told him she loved the way he looked at her. She told him anything to keep him tethered to the world. Then she heard it. Sirens. They were distant at first, then growing louder, a wailing chorus cutting through the winter air. Grace looked up, relief flooding her chest. They are here. Luca. They are here. Luca listened. His brow furrowed. He forced his eyes open, clarity returning for one sharp, painful moment. No, he wheezed. Not my men. Too loud. Grace froze. Dante wouldn't use sirens. The sound of tires crunching on gravel, screeching brakes, doors slamming, and then the amplified voice of authority booming from the driveway. This is the FBI. We have the perimeter surrounded. Come out with your hands up. Grace looked at the door, then back at Luca. Her heart broke. They had survived the hit squad, only to be caught by the wolf at the door. They will help you, she said, stroking his hair. They have paramedics. You will live. Luca grabbed her wrist again. His strength was almost gone, his fingers cold. He pulled her down until her ear was close to his lips. Grace, he whispered urgently, listen to me. I am here. Do not tell them I begged, he rasped, his voice fierce even in death's shadow. Just say I fought. Luca, promise me. I promise, she sobbed. I promise. His hand slid from her wrist, his eyes drifted shut, and his breathing hitched, then slowed to a barely perceptible rhythm. He was unconscious. The front door was kicked in. Men in tactical gear swarmed the room, rifles raised. Hands! Show me your hands! Grace raised her blood-soaked hands slowly, sitting protectively in front of Luca's motionless body. He needs help! She screamed at the faceless soldiers. He is dying! Help him! Paramedics pushed past the agents. Grace was pulled away, roughly but efficiently. She fought them for a second, trying to stay with him, but a female officer held her back. Let them work, ma'am. You have to let them work. Grace stood by the wall, shaking uncontrollably, watching as they cut open his shirt. She saw the devastating wound in his side. She saw the frantic movements of the medics, the IV lines, the gauze, and then she saw the glint of silver. They handcuffed his wrist to the stretcher rail before they even stabilized him. He is unconscious, Grace shouted. He's not going anywhere. Procedure, ma'am, the officer said, her voice flat. They loaded him onto the gurney and wheeled him out. Grace followed as far as the porch. The storm had finally broken. The sun was trying to pierce the clouds, casting a weak, pale light over the carnage. The front yard was filled with police cruisers, an ambulance, and black government SUVs. They loaded Luca into the back of the ambulance. The doors slammed shut, severing the connection between them. An officer draped a heavy foil blanket around Grace's shoulders. She was standing in the snow in her jeans and a blood-stained sweater, shivering violently, but she felt none of it. She felt only the hollow, crushing silence that Luca had left behind. She watched the ambulance drive away, lights flashing, taking the only man who had ever truly seen her. 3 months later, the snow had melted, revealing the brown, dormant grass of early spring. The cottage had been repaired, new windows, a new door, the blood scrubbed from the floorboards, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum of a memory Grace could not shake. She'd been questioned for weeks, the local police, the FBI, prosecutors. She told them the truth. Mostly. She told them about the crash. She told them about the attack. She told them she shot the intruder in self-defense. But when they asked about Luca, about what had happened between them in those 48 hours, she gave them nothing. She became the stone wall he had taught her to be. Did he threaten you? They asked. Did he force you to help him? Did he beg for his life when he was bleeding out? Grace had looked the federal agent in the eye, her chin high. He never begged, she said coldly. He fought. She had not heard a word since. He was in the system now, swallowed by a federal holding facility, facing charges that would put him away for a dozen lifetimes. She assumed she would never see him again, until the package arrived. It came via a private courier, a plain brown envelope with no return address. Grace signed for it with trembling hands. She took it into the kitchen, the same kitchen where he had kissed her, where they had argued, where she had hidden, and set it on the table. She used a knife to slit the seal. Inside, there was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper, no letterhead, no signature, just 3 words written in a bold, angular hand she recognized immediately. "You saved me." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. He was alive. He knew. She reached back into the envelope. There were 2 other items. The first was a silver key. It was old-fashioned, heavy, the kind that opened a door to something permanent. The second was a plane ticket. One way, first class, departure. Tomorrow morning, destination Sicily, Italy. Grace stared at the ticket. It was madness. It was abandoning her entire life, her home, her name, everything she knew, to chase a ghost who might not even be there. It was running toward danger instead of away from it. She looked around the empty kitchen. It was clean. It was safe. It was silent. She looked at the key in her hand. It felt warm against her skin. Grace Miller, the grieving widow who hid from the world, was gone. She had died in the snow 3 months ago. The woman standing in the kitchen was someone else entirely. She was a woman who knew how to shoot. She was a woman who knew how to survive. And she was a woman who was done waiting for permission to live. She picked up the ticket. Outside, the first bud of a crocus pushed through the thawing earth, but Grace did not see it. She was already packing. The journey took 17 hours. It involved a long flight across the ocean, a shorter flight over sparkling turquoise water, and finally, a drive along a winding coastal road that hugged cliffs so steep they made Grace's stomach turn. The air here was different. It did not bite with the frost of the city she had left behind. Instead, it tasted of salt, lemon, and sun-baked stone. The car dropped her off at the end of a long, gravel driveway lined with cypress trees. The driver, a silent man who had asked no questions, simply nodded and drove away, leaving her standing in the silence. Grace gripped the handle of her suitcase. In her pocket, the silver key felt heavy and warm against her hip. She looked up at the destination. It was a villa perched on the edge of the world, a sprawling structure of white stone and terracotta tiles, overlooking a sea so blue it looked like ink. It was beautiful. It was isolated. It was a fortress disguised as paradise. She walked up the driveway, the gravel crunching loudly under her boots. She had shed the heavy wool coat she had worn for months, dressed now in a light linen dress that felt foreign on her skin. She felt exposed without the layers of winter, without the armor of her grief. The front door was massive, made of dark, weathered wood. Grace hesitated. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a chaotic mix of hope and terror. What if the key did not fit? What if the villa was empty? What if he was not the man she remembered, but the ghost she had created in the long, lonely nights since the arrest? She took a breath that tasted of jasmine and sea salt. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. Grace pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of beeswax and old stone. The windows on the far side of the room were thrown wide open, framing the endless expanse of the ocean. White curtains billowed in the breeze, dancing like spirits. "I told them not to send a car until tomorrow," the voice came from the terrace. It was deep, rough, and unmistakably him. Grace dropped her suitcase. The sound echoed in the cavernous room. Lucas stepped through the open glass doors. He stopped dead when he saw her. He looked different. The gray pallor of blood loss was gone, replaced by a healthy, sun-touched bronze. The desperate, hunted look in his eyes had softened, though the vigilance was still there, lurking beneath the surface. He wore a loose white shirt, unbuttoned at the top, and linen trousers. He looked healed. He looked free. And he looked like he was seeing a hallucination. Grace could not move. She drank in the sight of him, The sharp angle of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell over his forehead, the scar she knew was hidden beneath his shirt. Luca walked slowly toward her, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, close enough to smell the soap and sea air on his skin. "Grace," he breathed, testing the name on his tongue. "You are alive," she whispered. "I am," he said. He looked at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart all over again. "I wasn't sure you'd come." The word snapped something inside her. The fear of the last 3 months, the interrogation rooms, the lonely nights staring at the ceiling, the terror of watching him bleed out in the snow, it all rushed to the surface in a blinding flash of white-hot anger. She stepped forward and slapped him. It was a hard, ringing blow that turned his head to the side. The sound cracked through the silence of the villa. Luca did not flinch. He did not look angry. He slowly turned his face back to hers, his eyes burning with an intensity that matched her own. "You left me," she choked out, tears spilling over her lashes. "You made me promise to let you go. You let me think you were gone forever. I had to," he rasped. "You didn't have to leave me alone. I had to make sure you were safe," he roared back, the calm facade shattering. "I had to make sure they wouldn't come for you. I traded everything, Grace. I gave them every name, every account, every route. I bought my life with the ruin of my empire, and I did it so I could stand here and look at you without seeing a target on your back." Grace stared at him, her chest heaving. He had burned his world down for her. He had become a traitor to his own kind, a man without a country, just to give her this key. The anger evaporated, replaced by a desperate, overwhelming need. She surged forward, grabbing the front of his shirt. Luca met her halfway. His arms wrapped around her, crushing her against him, lifting her off her feet. He kissed her, and it was nothing like the kisses in the cottage. Those had been tasted in the shadow of death. This was a kiss of life. It was hard, possessive, and deeply, agonizingly real. He tasted freedom and longing. Grace buried her hands in his hair, anchoring herself to him, sobbing into his mouth as he devoured her. "I missed you." He groaned against her lips, his voice breaking. "God, I missed you." He carried her through the villa, not breaking the kiss, moving blindly toward the bedroom where the sea breeze swept through the open windows. He lowered her onto the bed, his body covering hers, a heavy, grounding weight she had craved for 90 days. There was no darkness to hide in this time. The afternoon sun spilled across the sheets, illuminating every inch of them. Luca stripped the linen dress from her body with trembling hands, his gaze worshipful as he took her in. Grace reached for his shirt, pushing it off his shoulders, her fingers tracing the jagged, pink ridge of the scar on his side, the place where the bullet had entered, the place where she had pressed the towel to keep his life from leaking out. "It healed," she whispered, touching the skin. "You saved me," he said, leaning down to kiss the pulse fluttering in her throat. "You kept the blood in my veins long enough for the doctors to do the rest." They made love with the windows open to the sea, surrounded by the scent of salt and wild herbs. It was a desperate, joyful collision. There was no fear of intruders, no listening for sirens. There was only the slide of skin against skin, the sound of their breath mingling with the ocean, the feeling of being completely, irrevocably found. Grace arched into him, wrapping her legs around his waist, demanding everything he had to give. Luca gave it willingly. He worshipped her body with a slow, deliberate passion that made up for every second of their separation. He looked into her eyes as he moved inside her, forcing her to acknowledge the reality of this moment, the permanence of it. "I am here," he whispered with every thrust. "I am here. I am yours." When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the water in shades of violet and gold, they lay tangled together in the sheets, the cooling breeze drying the sweat on their skin. Grace rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "How did you do it?" she asked softly. "How are you here?" Luca ran his hand down the curve of her spine. "The feds didn't want me in a cell. They wanted the organization. I gave them the Valentini family. I gave them the routes. In exchange, they gave me a new name, a new history. And this place, it is a ghost property. Officially, it does not exist. And you? Grace asked, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. Do you exist? Only to you, he said. To the rest of the world. Luca the wolf is dead, buried in a federal prison grave. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His expression turned serious. But this life, it is quiet. Grace, it is small. There is no power here, no empire, just me, and the sea, and the silence. Are you sure this is what you want? You could have gone back to the city. You could have found a normal man. Grace looked at the scar on his chest. She thought of the empty cottage, the polite condolences of her neighbors, the hollow safety of a life without passion. I don't want a normal man, she said, and I don't want to be protected anymore. Luca, I spent my whole marriage being protected from the truth, and it almost killed me. She took his hand, intertwining their fingers. I want to stand beside you. Whatever this life is, whatever we build here, I want to be part of it, not as a widow, not as a victim, as your partner. Luca stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face. I am done with the underworld, Grace. I am done with the guns and the blood. But the instinct, it never truly goes away. I will always be dangerous. I know, she said. I am counting on it. He was silent for a long moment. Then, he squeezed her hand. I'm ready to put it all down. The violence, the past, but only if you ask me to. If you want me to be a soldier, I will be a soldier. If you want me to be a man who grows lemons and looks at the ocean, I will be that. Grace did not speak. She simply leaned down and kissed him, slow and deep, a seal on a contract written in survival and blood. She pulled back, smiling against his lips. Come back to bed, she whispered. The lemons can wait. 6 months later, it was December 24th. The villa was warm, the fireplace crackling with olive wood, filling the large stone room with a sweet, earthy scent. But outside, the air had turned strangely, impossibly cold. Grace stood by the antique dresser in the hallway. In her hand was the heavy black pistol, the one Luca had given her in the cottage, the one she had brought with her across the ocean. It was cleaned, oiled, and unloaded. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a small, velvet-lined box. She placed the gun inside. Are you sure? Luca's voice came from behind her. Grace turned. He was standing in the doorway, holding a box of glass ornaments. He looked at peace. The tension that used to live in his shoulders finally gone. We don't need it on the mantelpiece, Grace said softly. But we won't throw it away, just in case. Luca echoed the words he had said to her a year ago. Just in case. She agreed. She closed the drawer and locked it, sliding the key into her pocket. She walked over to him. Taking the box of ornaments, they moved to the center of the room, where a tall, fragrant pine tree stood. It was a tradition they had decided to reclaim, no longer a symbol of loneliness, but a marker of survival. They hung the glass spheres together, the silence between them comfortable and rich. Grace, Luca said, pausing with a silver star in his hand. Look outside. Grace turned to the terrace doors. She gasped. Against the backdrop of the dark, churning sea, white flakes were drifting down from the sky. They swirled in the wind, settling on the terracotta tiles, melting against the glass. It is snowing, she whispered. In the Mediterranean. A cold front, Luca said, moving to stand behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. They say it happens once every 50 years. Grace leaned back against him, watching the impossible weather. It felt like a message, a closing of the circle. They had met in a blizzard that brought death, and now, on their first Christmas Eve of a new life, the snow had returned to bless them with peace. It is beautiful, she said. Yes, Luca murmured, turning her in his arms so he could look into her face. It is. He did not look at the snow. He looked only at her. Grace reached up, cupping his face, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of his presence. They were thousands of miles from the cottage, living under false names, with a history written in blood and secrets, but standing there, in the glow of the firelight and the falling snow, none of it mattered. They were no longer alone. Luca lowered his head. They shared a silent kiss, soft and lingering, full of promises kept and a future reclaimed. "Merry Christmas, Luca," she whispered against his lips. "Merry Christmas, Angel." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, washing the past clean. Thank you so much for listening to Spread Your Legs and Let Me See. Young widow obeyed mafia boss alone. On Christmas Eve night, I hope you enjoyed Grace and Luca's journey from a frozen, dangerous night to a warm, hopeful future. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment down below and share your location. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the Mafia Romance Stories channel for more emotional, thrilling, and romantic tales. Don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts on the ending in English. Your support means the world to me. Happy reading!